Hey, Happy New Year. Welcome to 2022, everyone. This is Chris Joslin, your host for JOZ Bytes, coming at you again early in the year from a new venue. You can tell by my background, perhaps, that it's very Disney-like. I'm using my son's art room to come to you today with a little bit about the way I see not 2021 ending, but certainly 2022 starting. The question really is, how much of the federal dollars in this infrastructure bill and everything else is going to come at the people that really truly need it, not just in supply chain, but across the entire industry? Join us today as we discuss this a little bit, dive into a little bit of depth, and start out the new year right, and let old lang synes be old lang synes, and let the future bear some fruit for all of us on this edition of JOZ Bytes. So everyone, the beginning of every year, I think we all as human beings come to a awareness of where we've been, a path we traveled to get to where we are. Sometimes unbeknownst to us, sometimes circumstances overwhelm us, certainly. Sometimes it's a plan and our design that has brought us to where we are at, but we are where we are. That is what we can truly say. And we can look back and we can hem and haw and we can grind our teeth and tell everyone that we would have rather done something this way or that way. And I think we all have that, not as a regret side, but certainly as a cognitive awareness of what we have gone through, what we could have done about certain aspects of what we've gone through. But at the beginning of every year, we are where we are. It's kind of how the new year develops itself into something transitional and possibly transformational. The supply chain industry has come into magnified focus for most of the public across the last 2 years, mainly because of the pandemic, the vaccinations that had to be rolled out, a lot of the transportation mechanics of that, certainly on the frozen and the refrigerated side of the supply chain business. But even more so of late into the economics of how we as Americans purchase products, how we have them delivered to our homes versus going to the stores, how we're getting back into that in certain states, how we're going back out of that into a buy everything at home status for the next God knows how long with this Omicron variant. So there's a lot of variables up in the air, that a lot of unknowns. They're always at the beginning of the year. But one of the things that the new year gives us is a platform, is a clean slate for the future lying ahead. That's always the case every single day. Your future is unwritten and you've got to be able to sit down and make some decisions and move forward on it. But in terms of supply chain, in terms of what we've gone through in the last year in particular, we've seen a bunching, we've seen a clog in the pipes, as one of my previous podcasts went into. That podcast, by the way, which was at least 6 months ago or maybe more, had to do with the Suez Canal and the Ever Given steamship line that was caught on the shore there and had to be relieved from that, and the backup that it caused just on a single vessel. Now you look out into the Pacific and you see the number of, and it's starting to get alleviated somewhat, but you see the number of steamship lines parked off the Pacific coast of LA, Long Beach. And now, for environmental reasons, they have pushed them even further offshore, which is partly from a political standpoint and a correct thing for them to do for perception purposes. But in terms of how it impacts the supply chain, it's greatly. A lot of the things people wanted to give and get for Christmas and the holiday season went into probably gift cards for the most part. I haven't seen the statistics on it yet, but I would imagine that this year, above many years in the past, there's been more and more gift cards than anything else. Because when the products aren't on the shelf, the way that retail stores can continue to make profit is to get those cards out there into the hands of the consumers so they can buy the product physically once it does come in. This has been common for many years and will continue to be that way, but I would suspect that this may be an anomalous blip on the radar in terms of an uptick in that kind of purchase capability and probability. I'm certainly part of that crowd, though I've loved gift cards for many years because it enables you to get something for somebody when you really don't know exactly what to get them. So that's something to consider. But in terms of supply chain in the world that we live in, I talked about a clog in the pipes, Suez Canal, as I mentioned a little bit ago. What that was at the time was a really, really big deal. Still is when you're looking at the economic impact for Western Europe, for the steamship lines themselves, for the increase in rates that you saw over the ocean lanes. But it was really just a microcosm of what has happened overall. And what will continue to happen will take some time to rebalance itself. Anytime you have something that shuts down our world like this COVID-19 pandemic has done, it creates imbalances. Those imbalances were created on the supply side, they were created on the employer-employee side, they were created on how we purchase and manage our lives. So when we look at these things overall, we have to give an understanding of that aspect of it. When networks become unbalanced, the systems themselves, the links in the supply chain, as it were, have to be moving at a similar speed in multiple directions. To give you a visual of that, just picture the United States as a whole and some of the large metropolitan areas, New York, Los Angeles, Houston, Chicago, Atlanta, Dallas, Memphis, places like that, these huge consuming areas. The product has to flow into those areas for those consumers to have access to them. Those products are linked together by different transportation services within the supply chain industry itself. So when manufacturing goes down in parts of the world or the parts of the country and consuming continues, freight still has to move. Has to move with skeleton crews perhaps, has to move in different methods perhaps, and the equipment, the space needed to move those products has to rebalance itself to the areas that it's needed in. So what ends up happening is if you have areas that are completely shut down in areas that are up in manufacturing, say raw materials or some finished goods for the market, then those areas have to utilize railroad equipment and full truckload equipment and LTL assets and steamship line containers and the chassis and everything else to fulfill that. But if there's not enough freight, if there's not enough capacity, if there's not enough balance coming back to the areas where you need to source that equipment, then you end up with huge piles sitting of containers stacked on top of each other in the ports or in a field in Iowa. It just depends on the situation. I know I'm oversimplifying that, but the reality is, as stuff comes back online, if stuff comes back online slowly, and if somebody was managing the overall system appropriately, you would be able to bring on capacity where it's needed most, but in a slow, methodical manner to match manufacturing and the supply and demand curve there is. But that's not what happens. What happens is everybody stops working, but everybody continues to consume. And those that work to create the products that people consume can no longer do so. So you have this equation that goes entirely unbalanced. This is not rocket science. This is something that if you think about it for more than a few minutes, you would know as a human being buying stuff. All you have to do is go to the grocery store and see what's not there versus what is there, what people are telling you is going to be short coming soon, all that kind of thing. Now, some people think of this as a doomsday scenario and start hoarding toilet paper, as we saw at the very beginning in 2020. I go into the Costco and they were metering out toilet paper as if it was gold. Well, okay, maybe the people are going to sell a lot of bidets. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is whether it's toilet paper, whether it's the supply of chicken and beef and the price increase that you see associated with that has to do partly with all the inflation and things you're seeing right now, but it has a lot to do with the imbalance. So this really isn't a manufacturing capacity issue as much as it is a consumption issue. You exacerbate that because a lot of the people that would go out and spend money dining at their local, restaurant, or going out for beers on a night at the bar, or going on short excursions of vacations and things like that, when you pull away all the services that were getting hit by this pandemic and still get hit by this pandemic, and at the same time you incent people, as they should, the government should incent people when they're forcing people to stay home for quote unquote everybody's protection. You're feeding money into a system that doesn't have as much to buy and isn't buying services, so instead is going to buy products that can be shipped directly to their house, thus putting even more pressure on the supply chain system. All of this to say, guys, is that the more and more you move forward, the more and more you identify supply chain and transportation industry as an integral part of not what we just do on a day-to-day basis being in that industry, but what people need to understand is integral to their lives itself. I've said this before on podcasts. I used to sell TVs and stereos, computers, things like that long ago. And I remember at the time, the only thing I thought about transportation was why it wasn't my product here when I wanted it here. I didn't really connect the dots at that time as to why all these things happened. But when this stuff gets thrust into the mainstream media, certainly online, and certainly these are issues that need to be dealt with, imbalances that need to be recalibrated. The question is, how do we do that? Now, if you're just using math, if you're just using vector analysis, if you will, or geometry, and looking at the map and saying, where do we need to position our assets, and somebody controlled all those pieces on the table, then it's not so hard. You move things around and you place them where they need to be at the moment, but it's not the way our society works. There are independent parties, there are difficult and specific things about the transportation industry that need to combine multiple parties. Using an example, you need to have a variety of chassis pools to associate itself with a variety of steamship line boxes, FEUs, TEUs. Those are, TEUs means 20-foot equivalent unit, FEU 40-foot equivalent unit. Those are internationally understood unit of measurements for containers so that there's a sameness across the international steamship line community. But there are certain chassis that go with certain ones in different countries. In the United States, there's multiple chassis pools. And if you don't have enough chassis to facilitate offloading containers, or all your chassis are currently underneath containers that are sitting at a giant distribution center for one of the big box stores or one of the online stores that we all buy from, and waiting to be offloaded because they bought the capacity, then you're slowing up the system. Now, I want to be clear about this. Their systems and capacity and the measurement of lack of capacity, deficits and overages in capacity, those things are quantified by one particular common denominator, and that is time. Now, time is the element that we place into all this to move products around, to move transportation pieces around the proverbial supply chain game board, if you will. And the faster or more efficient within the time frame we can do that, the better our systems are. And the less expensive our systems are, because the amount of actual versus virtual capacity changes with the element of time. One of the best examples of that I can talk to, in one of the primary things that I'm predicting the year 2022 will not really change at all, is driver capacity. You know, the driver world in transportation, logistics, full truckload, commercial drivers, CDL drivers, has been at deficit for years and years and years. Not deficit because there aren't enough people to fill the roles needed, but deficit because there are restrictions to allowing those that are in the field to fulfill the necessary time allotment to get the job done. Real MIT white paper was put out, MIT Transportation, I think it's called the Transport Labs, if I remember correctly. I had this on a previous podcast as well. Go back and look at some of my JOZ Bytes stuff at iLevelLogistics.com. That's iLevelLogistics.com. Probably coming across your screen right about now. It's a great place to go and get your aggregated, curated information. We have industry indicators that are proprietary. We have Road Scholar articles that we put out all the time. We have these kind of videos and others just to bring out news that is important to those both inside and outside the transportation world. But the driver capacity issue, getting back to that, MIT basically went through a large analysis across several years of time and really discovered they were pointing more at the downtime that drivers have delivering to a lot of consignees and the KPIs that those consignees may have that keep drivers out of actually doing what their title tells them to do, and that's drive. It basically said, it comes down to that without going into too much depth, that if you put the driver actually physically on the road 12 more minutes per day, that at the time of that study, which was I believe about 2 years ago, there would be no driver capacity issue. The driver capacity issue at the time, I believe, was 57,000 needed drivers to fill the particular capacity deficit that was being analyzed. That capacity deficit is more like 80,000 now, maybe even more, and is estimated to be 160,000 deficit drivers by the year 2030. Part of this has to do with the driver age, which in the United States, the average age is in the high 40s. Europe, Britain, for instance, is in the low 50s for that. So doing something to make the industry more attractive is vitally important. Certainly the number one thing on that list is pay and respect. And I talked about this. I think the name of that particular podcast, if you want to look up, was Driver Centrism. I had an article out on that as well. I think that there needs to be a reformulation of the thought process around the importance of drivers in our world. They are the touchstone. They're the touch point with your shippers, your receivers, all the pieces in between, whether it's the railroads, whether it's the steamship line, the ports of entry, the ports of deportation. It is vitally important to have drivers that are professional, aware, oftentimes entrepreneurial, and take on their task and their job as something that's very important. Now, you can look over the years and say there's a lot of reasons behind why drivers are looked at as not as vital as they truly are. But the reality is they are. We could get into the psychology of that, but ultimately, this is not something that's going to be solved right away. Now, I know that I had a discussion with a client not too long ago about the Port of Savannah and some governmental agency looking at the regulations at the time, and on particular steamship line boxes coming in through that deep water port now in Savannah, which is very, very popular to get some of the freight off the West Coast in through the Panama Canal and over to the East Coast where it is needed. They were temporarily allowing greater than 80,000 pounds on particular road corridors for those steamship line boxes, thus eliminating the need for some of the transloading that goes on there to move things off of steamship line boxes, putting them on pallets, getting them into 53-foot trailers and off to their destinations. Now that can't be done with everything, but that can be done with certain commodity types, certain destinations that don't need the deliveries to be anything other than those steamship line boxes. And what it did is it creates an efficiency. So there are a lot of things you can do. And a lot of times the government, for instance, with this infrastructure bill, they just tend to throw money at things. Now, what things they throw it at is an entirely different debate, and we could talk for hours about whether pieces of that infrastructure really should be called that or really going to the right places, or whether they're going down boondoggle, holes. There's all those things are usually true. But ultimately, efficiency and speed is where it's at, because that takes virtual capacity and creates it out of whole cloth. Just again, to reiterate this thing, if you have 100 pieces of equipment and they all can move twice per month, that means you can get 200 loads or spaces worth of product moving on that month with those 100 containers or trailers. If you can move that up to 2.5, then you've just increased by 25% the capability of that space to move product from A to B. So that virtual capacity on those 100 containers just went from 200 units of measured movement to 225 or 250, excuse me. So you can see the power in that. So when you go back and look at the driver issue, if you can hire 80,000 more drivers, that's great. But who are you going to hire? People right out of high school? Can't do that for interstate. You can do some of that for local intrastate moves at 18 to 21, but you need to be over 21. There needs to be a mentorship program. I know a lot of those things are going into place. But the fact is that if you looked at some of the burdensome regulation that is out there, and I'm not anti-regulation. I think there is regulatory capture. I had a podcast specifically about that you can go back and listen to as well. But I believe that if you looked at taking just a few of the regulations, because there's a lot of them, whether they're environmental impact regulations, whether they're the speed of transport governors that are on different tractors and trailers, excuse me, not trailers, but tractors, whether it's a weight limitation for the road, which is, there's a safety issue involved in there. So you don't want to eliminate safety, but with a lot of the new technologies coming out there, front-facing, rear-facing cameras, a lot of the auto braking things that are going to be regulated over the course of time, there's a lot of very cool, good regulation things that are coming out, but all of those, and I mean all of them, require either more bodies or better understanding of efficiencies and technologies to make them happen. So when you have a pandemic, it's not enough to say park those steamship lines off further because you're putting too much carbon dioxide in the air over LA. Trust me, that's part of it. But part of it also is figuring out a way to relieve some regulation to speed up the process of getting those things into port, offloaded, efficiently put onto some method of steel wheel interchange from the harbor to rail for inland, or a rubber wheel exchange at a cross dock, whatever the case may be. So 12 more minutes on the highway. I want you to think about that. If someone's average day is 8 days and we're adding 12 minutes to that, less than a quarter of an hour. So even looking at things that are not regulations, like speeding up the process by a quarter an hour to offload a driver would put them on the road at least 12 more minutes a day and solve a lot of our problem. Now, I don't have the answers to any of this. They're much more complex than I'm talking about here, but I think it's important to throw these things out there to give people a better understanding of exactly what we're talking about. There's not endless capacity out there. Supply and demand works with services and it works with products. If you go to a store and they're out of toilet paper, you can't buy what's not there. If you go to a port and there's 20 trucks sitting there, but there's no drivers to put in those trucks to pick up the containers, then you can't pick them up. So you either got to fill those seats or you got to find a way to utilize the assets you have in a slightly more efficient manner so that you can get your job done. That's vitally, vitally important. So, a clog in the system, for sure. Is that procrastination? Procrastination number one. No, that would not be my New Year's resolution is to procrastinate more. It would be probably less, but to prognosticate for sure. And number one prognostication is we're not going to get through this driver shortage this year. There's too much going on from a state, local, regional, and even national level from government infighting to watch regulation be peeled back enough to make the important steps. If that can be done through effective management of the private sector, the delivery or the utilization of space within the yards, maybe that can be done from that way, but it ain't going to happen this year. So prognostication number one, pretty easy. It sounds like I'm being ultra negative. There's going to be steps made, but we're going to have a very large driver deficit to continue through pretty much this year, 2022 for sure. The other one is that the clog in the system overall will not right itself either. I think it'll be June at the earliest before you see some relief off of, well, certainly we were already down off the high numbers, but we considered a year ago a high number of like 37 ships sitting out there. I think you're going to continue to see stuff like that and bunching at rail terminal heads and a continuation of price inflation to try to clear those terminals, whether it's port terminals, rail terminals, trucker yards, LTL facilities, whatever the case may be, because when you have too much flow going into central or specific hubs of transportation, then you have to relieve that somehow. And the way to do that is to make pricing going into those facilities where the supply is too high raised. So supply and demand. If there's more demand into an area, then you have to clean that up. So you have to gauge your pricing around the destinations you're moving to and from. It used to be when everything was fairly fluid and you got a little bit of a hiccup of too much boxes, too much capacity, whether it's chassis or anywhere else, the underlying facilitators of those programs and those processes, let's use the railroad as an example, would discount a rate from an area of surplus to an area of deficit. You will see now that the pricing pretty much staying the same or even a little higher from those areas of surplus to where they're deficit, but the price is extremely inflated going from deficit areas to surplus areas. That is partly to manage the balance that we're talking about. Partly is frankly recouping a lot of the energy and money that was put into the last 2 years of surviving this kind of thing. Now, the third and last thing I wanted to talk about real quick was regulation. I touched on it when we talked about the driver situation as well. But regulation is all as an edifice, if you will, or a block of items, is something that I think we need to continue as a industry to focus very closely on and watch very closely and try to determine where to manage the regulations. To be in business, you have to look at these. You have to get the certifications necessary. You have to look at the regulations that are required and adhere to them, or you'll be out of business pretty quick, whether it's OSHA or whether it's a city or a governmental regulation, or whether it's a new law like an AB5 in California that comes out. There are a lot of different things to comply with. I had a discussion around the Orange County I want to call it Air Resource Board, but it was called something else than that. But the Orange County folks put into place a regulatory impact for emissions from warehouses. This impact does not just manage and measure the warehouse exportation of emissions, because that's really what it's looking at. There are level meters on either upwind, downwind of these facilities to measure its output of carbon dioxide and other particulates. And they're measured to a standard that's ever changing. The standards back 30 years ago, and you can look up that podcast as well, are considerably different than they are today. But no matter the case, things change. The goalposts move, and you have to be able to move with them and adapt to them. That's part of being in any business. So these regulatory changes are very important, but there's a aspect to them that is not generally thought of, and that's the down push to smaller businesses. Regulations in general they're designed to be helpful for the communities at large. People in general, safety, health and wellness, the environmental issues that we all talk about and understand and move forward with. But they also have an initial, especially short-term, harmful impact on most businesses. All businesses really are under the same umbrella of affect with these regulations. The one I just mentioned talks about warehouses of 100,000 square feet or more, and actually 50 if you read the particulars of that directive. But what you don't realize is also tells these people that you must regulate those coming into and out of your facility. Now that means everybody. It's kind of like the vaccine mandate that's out now. I think the Ninth Circuit just approved. It'll probably go to the Supreme Court, but for the time being, the Biden administration mandated that any private business over 100 employees would have to require vaccination. They already did that for the public employee groups, governmental employees. They've exempted some, they always do, and it's always questionable as to why and who they exempt, and it's a very interesting study to look at that and try to understand what's really going on. But for the private sector, 100 employees or more. Challenge with that, of course, is that the large employees, which those are 100 employees or more, pretty substantial companies, they all use companies that are smaller than that. So you tend to see right away that there's a impact all the way down the line, because these big companies must use small companies, and they're going to make the small companies, just like we talked about with that particulate environmental Orange County, California ordinance that went into effect. They're going to push these regulations down to those parties. I think there's a tipping point with some of this that's coming. Now, I know that the government, federal and state in particular, try to subsidize these massive changes that are going to occur. And when I say they're going to occur, I mean they're going to occur. Electrification of the industry is on its way, unless something else comes along that's better. Now, whether we have enough chips being manufactured anywhere in the world to accommodate that, another question entirely and for a different day. But I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. I am a very definitive advocate of less regulation, not more. I think that regulations in general can be pared down, focused in on the most important aspects of what you do, and then graduated in a way where they take effect very few at a time and over time. As much as I get tired of hearing about the governmental slowdowns that occur, the aspect of never being able to get a lot done because of one party or another fighting for things, I think our government was put in place. I don't think it is. It was put in place for that kind of thing. It was put in place in general to make things very, very difficult to get done. And so when you see regulations going in one direction, you know the pendulum will swing back in some others. In Southern California, where my companies are, you don't see that happening as quickly or as easily. So how this all ends up, I don't know. But prognostication number 3 is through the first half of this year, regulation is going to start to slow down a bit. The mandates overall and in general, I think including the vax thing is going to be very interesting. Where the Supreme Court goes with that, we shall see. But a lot of the state-to-state mandates, a lot of the fiscally impactful mandates that businesses are being regulated, frankly, some businesses are being regulated out of existence because they can't afford what larger companies can afford to accommodate. And those larger companies, of course, are recouping the business the smaller companies have that are going out of business. So you can see the double-edged sword there. But again, the prognostication is that over the course of this year, because of politics, because of the burdensome tipping point that some of this regulation is going to, I think you will see it taper off through Q3 and Q4. That's my prediction. So prediction number 1, driver capacity, going to get worse, not better. It can be accommodated, but nobody's going to take the steps to do it, to get more efficient. I don't see people on the shipper, receiver side doing it. I certainly don't see the government doing it. I certainly don't see the easing of the regulations that force drivers into a HOS framework, an hours of service framework, that doesn't differentiate between drivers of huge tenure versus new ones. I don't see that changing at all. Prognostication number 2 is that the balance in the system, the overall clog in the supply chain pipeline, as it will ease up, but it'll ease up to what's going to feel kind of like normal by the end of this year. That would have looked like at the beginning of 2021, like bad news coming. That's going to be a more normalized thing. You're going to see rates stay up. They're not going to be at the ultimate highs that you saw a couple of months ago, but you are going to see inflated pricing. That isn't going to go away. There's a new norm coming for that. So the price of transportation, now when we look at our products themselves, it might be cents on the dollar for some of these products. So as a consumer, you might not see that impact. That impact is quadrupled because of inflation of near 7% right now. But again, that's a whole other story. That's monetary policy of supply and demand. You can't just throw money at everything, and you certainly can't create it. I wish I could. My printer's just not good enough. That is a joke, by the way. And then the third is that the regulations themselves are going to be tapered back. Now that's very generalistic. I'm going to, in future podcasts, get a little more specific on each of those subjects. I think the driver one in particular is front and center in everybody's mind. I think that needs to be an area of entire reevaluation. I think that is a job, as it turns into a driver/pilot job, will change the world significantly in the transportation industry. How quickly we go to, no or very little, I think it was, zero emission or very little emission vehicles is going to be interesting to see, and there's going to be a lot of governmental subsidies to try to push that. I've got a good friend that just dove into that industry very strongly, and maybe we'll get him on in the near future to talk about where his company is going with things like that. There's all kinds of interesting solutions along that line. But for now, I just wanted to give you a goodbye to 2021. I'm glad to see it go for the most part, and a hello to 2022, and a hello to everyone out there. New things going on for most everybody, I assume. Everybody with their resolutions in place and their prognostications, which hope is not procrastination. And I'm looking forward to talking to you more and more. One other special announcement that'll come out within the next few weeks, hopefully, is a design change around iLevelLogistics.com. More interviews to come, more podcasts to come, more articles to come, more curation to come, but maybe a different focus on the overall direction of that particular site and what it's designed to do for the community at large out there. And as always, we invite you to be part of that. Go to iLevelLogistics.com, sign up for the daily, which is a tremendous asset to the people that I talk to in the industry that love to go to that. They can see designated articles and videos and things designed just for that site, and they can see things across the whole spectrum of our industry, things even outside the industry that impact our industry itself. So sign up for that. You'll get an email pushed to you. Go to YouTube, go to Instagram or Facebook or wherever you, Twitter, whatever you like to go to see your news and be a part of the conversation. Give us some feedback. We've had a mailbag discussion some time ago. We'll probably have another one of those soon. Those were fun. And in the meantime, we're going to be looking forward to seeing much, much more of you in 2022. Have a great day.